shares. Okay, so we did part 1 last Sabbath, right? Yeah, in the afternoon last Sabbath. And it's part 1 was Don't I Have the Freedom, part 1. And this one's a relatively short presentation, also just like the last one. And I'm not very good at summaries. So, but a lot of it has to do with someone was asking, don't I have the freedom? So don't I have the freedom to do this? Don't I have the freedom to do that? And she answered them, no, you do not have the freedom in this movement to do according to your own will. Basically, it has to be within the bounds of what the movement is, what God is telling the movement that we can do. So we still don't have the right to just wear makeup, and some of the other things that they were, thinking that they just had the freedom to just do whatever. We have to live within what God is guiding us to do. And Elder Tess said she was in that same situation, that she's not dictating to us what she thinks we have to do. She's dictating, she's just passing on what God is telling us to do. And so anyway, that's not a full summary of what we presented, but that was what I was getting, the main gist. And what I want to remind us now that, okay, so this was presented on June 27, 2020. And so 2021, that's almost 2 years ago, almost, because this is April 2022. And in the Vespers class, we're going over libertarianism, freedom and equality, atheism and such. But she started talking about freedom and liberty, religious liberty, 2 years ago. So while we're going through this presentation, please keep that in mind, that she's been talking about this. She's already been talking about this for 2 years. And so I want everybody to see that as we're talking about this. And I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, because and you're always welcome to interrupt, because sometimes I start talking too fast, and I'll try to talk slow and make pauses. But please, if you have things to talk about in this, and connections to make with the Vespers, and please interrupt. Okay.
Yeah, and just real quick, while you're talking about it, see how long she's been talking about it. What's the increase of knowledge of the Sunday law on the big line?
Equality, gender equality. And then, well, it was feminism, and then radical feminism.
Right.
Yeah.
2019 feminism. Yeah,
exactly. So she's been talking about it. We just haven't, as in, I know personally myself, haven't connected all the dots. I need really straightforward language, because I am not really good at just seeing and reading behind what somebody's talking about. I'm not good at it. Just my brain just.
I'm with you there.
Okay. God is like, maybe I just needed that long, because look how long it took to cut my hair. I mean, she cut her hair, months and months ago, and it took, so it takes a while for us to let go of that baggage.
Yeah.
But I think the timing of us letting go of that baggage is going to increase quickly. And when next time, I don't think I'm going to have as much time to hesitate. When I see something that needs to be cut loose, I need to cut it loose.
I think that's the whole journey of getting us prepared to be the soldiers.
Yeah.
That's how I've understood it too, to be able to ready to follow.
I kind of see that with, Gideon's army, like when God said, all of those who, are such and such, you can leave. Well, those people that did stay, they had to search their hearts and their minds. Okay, am I part of that group? Do I need to go? right? You know, they don't talk about that, but all of those people had to search their own hearts and say in their minds, you know, am I going to stay? You know, and that's what we're doing right now. God's having us cut loose of things, and like we're having to say, well, am I going to stay? Will I cut loose of that baggage, and will I stay?
Yeah.
That's the way I see Gideon's army getting smaller and smaller. I don't know. It's my interpretation. Okay, so don't I have the freedom part 2? And she starts off with, I want to ask a question of our participants. And if you can, just write the answer in the chat. Give me a date. Where are we in Millerite history as of June 2020? And people answered in the chat 1844, 1845, and this was, like I said, June 2020, 1846, 1848, 1850. Those were their answers. She says, it's interesting, we have a couple of answers. What information don't you have? And okay, and I want to preface this. Okay, so this was back 2 years, almost 2 years ago, and she was saying Sister Adriana, brother Ray, or you know, and she was using sister and brother, and I took the liberty of taking all the brothers and sisters out of that, you know, and only put in the names. And also when it came to talking about God, I tried to replace all the he and hims with God. So I took a little bit of liberty in pronouns in this document. Okay, so Adriana says, what line? So when she asked the question, I want to ask a question, give me a date, where are we in the Millerite history? And Adriana says, what line? So everyone's answers are correct, but the answer, I think I tricked you all. Adriana made the point that I wanted to make. Which line are you talking about? And Brendan says, it depends. And it does depend on the line you're talking about. So we tried to say before, there's a number of applications for the beginning of modern Israel, and you don't know what my theme is. You need to know what the theme of the line is before you would answer. I'm sorry, I'm making up words. You need to know what the theme of the line is before you would understand what point I'm trying to make. Before you say, where are we in the beginning of the Millerite history, we have to know what theme we're talking about. So if we are here, okay, so she drew it. We draw their line. So this is the 144,000 of ancient Israel. The same thing that we did for the, okay, so this is the line of ancient Israel. When we saw that the Sunday law, the end of ancient Israel, was what day? It was 34 AD. So 34 AD lines up with 1850 on the Millerite line, which lines up with Sunday law. So we are not at 1850. So that was then 2 years ago. They were not at 1850 because they weren't at the Sunday law yet. So we are not at that Sunday law waymark yet, that Daniel 11:41. And so on the big line, we're not there yet either, right? But if I was to draw their reform line, I'm going to extend this portion. So this portion after the Sunday law, she extended it. You would have 1798, 1840, 1850, 1861, 1863, and that is their overarching line, the whole thing. I think we've taught this a couple of times now, but it hasn't been really repeated and reinforced. So it may be unfamiliar to some that their overarching line would begin, of course, at 1798, then 1840, 1850 is the Sunday law waymark, 1861 is the close of probation, entering into the time of trouble. And the time of trouble is for them what history? That's the Civil War. Then you can do a fractal of this history. So, and you would take us under here, so under the Millerite 144 line, and we could see that there's this other group, the Millerites, who were called out of the church, out of the Protestant churches. They're the first group called. So this is the 144 line, the big line of the Protestants, right, of God's church. And then the Millerites were the ones that were called out of that line. And this is their fractal. So they're the first group called. At 1850, they're going to take that gospel to the world. But in 1798, this first group is called out, and you have William Miller, Litch, Samuel Snow, etc. So they're the first fractal that we can create from this reform line. But this is their 144,000 line if Christ was to come back in 1863. So if Christ actually came back in 1863, this would be that reform line. So now where are we on the lines? And Adriana said, which line? Are we referring to this, this Millerite line or this 144 line? It depends on our theme, because I wanted to introduce a different theme. When you come to 1861, it's the close of probation, but Adventism for this history, they've already failed, haven't they? Prior to 1861, the close of probation, they have already made their mistake under the second angel. They've already been scattered. They've already rejected time and the 2520, the key that unlocks time. So by 1861, they've already failed. And when they fail in 1861, what do they have to do? Because they're not going to go to heaven in 1863. They're going to continue as a church. They don't know for how long. They've lost time. What do they have to do now to survive through that history? They've messed all this up. They've messed up what they were meant to do. They've lost their prophetic message. They've gone into Laodicea. And I want to say here, we're in 1862. This 1861 is 2019. This 1862 is 2020. This 1863 is 2021. So she's making an application for us. It is our harvest. We've been through our close of probation. We are in the Jacob's time of trouble. We're here because of the theme of organization. Okay, and so remember again, this is 2 years ago. When the Millerites failed in this history, because it's a history of failure, they get to their close of probation, and what do they need to do? They're going to need to be organized. Prior to this 1861 history, it is chaos and dysfunction. They can no longer go forward with the work unless they take a step back and organize. They began organizing in 1861. They complete that process in 1863. It's a dispensational bookend, this work of organization. I want to quote Ellen White from Review and Herald, August 27, 1861, paragraph 1. I was shown, so this is Ellen White, I was shown that some have been fearing that they should become Babylon if they organize. But the churches in central New York have been perfect Babylon, confusion. And now, unless the churches are so organized, they can carry out and enforce, so organized that they can carry out and enforce order, they have nothing to hope for in the future. They must scatter into fragments. Previous teachings have nourished the elements of disunion. A spirit has been cherished to watch and accuse rather than build up. If ministers of God would unitedly take their position and maintain it with decision, there would be a uniting influence among the flock of God. Separating bars would be broken to fragments. Hearts would flow together and unite like 2 drops of water. So what is required for the uniting of hearts? Organization. When we come back to the history of the end of ancient Israel, where are we on that line? As priests, as disciples, we are approaching the upper room experience. They're putting aside their differences. The disciples in that dispensation united. Their hearts flow together. They unite like 2 drops of water. It was necessary to approach the work of Pentecost. And Ellen White is saying this experience is brought about by organization. Quoting from Ellen White, then there would be power and strength in the ranks of Sabbath keepers, far exceeding anything we have yet witnessed. The hearts of God's servants are made sad by meeting, as they journey from church to church, the opposing influence of other ministering brethren. Individuals have stood ready to oppose every step of the advance God's people have made. Advancing what? Organization. Those who have dared to venture out had their hearts saddened and distressed by the lack of union of action on the part of their fellow laborers. We are living in solemn times. We are, Elder Tess, we are living in a time of trouble. Ellen White, the agitation of the subject of organization has revealed a great lack of moral courage on the part of ministers proclaiming present truth. Some who were convinced that organization was right failed to stand out boldly and advocate it. They let some few understand that they favored it. Was this all God required of them? No, he was displeased with their cowardly silence and lack of action. They feared blame and opposition. They watched the brethren generally to see how their pulse beat before standing manfully. Opposition to that word, for what they believed to be right. The people waited for the voice of their favorite minister to the truth. And because they could hear no response in favor from them, decided that the subject of organization was wrong. Thus, the influence of some of the ministers was against this matter, while they professed to be in favor. They were afraid of losing their influence. Someone must move here and bear responsibility and venture his influence. And as he has become accustomed to censure and blame, he has suffered to bear it. Okay, so let's see. Those who shun responsibility will meet with loss in the end. The time for ministers to stand together is when the battle goes hard. So I think she's talking a lot of two men, because there's a lot more men of course, in leadership positions. So we can now change all of these to them, women and men, right? Okay, so it's 1861. You've entered into the time of trouble and what has begun to take place, the organization of the movement. You can see it in the line of Christ. When you take the beginning of the harvest of the disciples, it's the cross right here. So this is on the line of the disciples. It's the cross. They go through this 40-day experience, and leading up to Pentecost, what did they do? They organized themselves. You can see that on both of the lines of the end of ancient Israel, and whether you're referring to the history of where the baptism lines up with 2019, then Jesus goes out and gets his disciples. He begins the steps of organization. When you think about the application of the priest as that first group called, you can see it in the upper room experience. So the first group called out of the Millerites, they had to organize. The first group called out of Jesus's time, the disciples, they had to organize, and we have to organize, or we did during that time. It's organization that was to unite the people of God in 1861, to unite their hearts, that they would flow together as two drops of water. And what is the accusation people are making? How are people responding to this organization work? Quote from Ellen White, "I was shown that some have been fearing they would become Babylon if they were to organize." What are they saying? What is Babylon? Babylon is a dictatorship. But for the churches in central New York, the movement was already Babylon because it was confusion. Quote from Ellen White, "And now, unless the churches are so organized that they can carry out and enforce order, they have nothing to hope for in the future. They must scatter into fragments." Okay, so Elder Tess, why do we have this time period between 2019 and 2021 that perfectly lines up with 1861, 1862, 1863? It's because this movement is in disorder and confusion. Elder Jeff was no longer leader from 2014, but it took him 5 years to step back from that role. When he finally did, he left this movement in chaos, disorder, and confusion. And the work since then has been to clean up that act, to organize the work so it can carry out and enforce order. And at every step, individuals have stood ready to oppose the work of God. Quote from Ellen White, "Then there would be power and strength in the ranks of Sabbath keepers, far exceeding anything we have witnessed." Elder Tess, if this work was accomplished, then it will be accomplished by Pentecost, because then what do we receive? Power and strength. Ministers have enabled this confusion and disorder. They have scattered into fragments. Quote from Ellen White, "Previous teachings have nourished the elements of disunion." Elder Tess, what we're doing in this time period while we're shut down by the coronavirus is organizing the movement. It's taking care of the disorder and the chaos, but the opposition is great. It was then, so you know that it is now. It was back in 1861 and 1863. They faced a great deal of opposition, and it's the exact condition of the movement today. I want to take you to Review and Herald October 12, 2000, and I'm just making things up. October 12, 1905, paragraph 15 and 16. She, Ellen White, is looking back at 1861, 1863. She's talking about the work in 1861. Okay, so I just noticed the time. I'm on page 5. This is a 15-page document.
I'm okay if everybody else is to finish it, and just we have a different schedule today. We started at a different time at 9:30 instead of 8:30, so I'm okay. But how's everybody else feel about that?
I'm okay with continuing. Is there any opposition to that?
They're
I'm
non-speaking.
okay with it.
Nope, no opposition here.
Okay.
Nope. Fine with me.
Okay, I will continue. Thank you. Okay. Okay, she says, so Ellen White, the feeling against organization was very strong among our people. The movement generally, who had withdrawn from the churches of the various denominations under the call of the second angel's message, come out of Babylon, opposed organization. Elder Tess, the feeling among members of this movement who were called out of the apostate conservative Adventism under the call of the second angel in the history of our latter reign is largely opposed to organization. Ellen White, and many Seventh-day Adventists are fearful that church organization will bring us under condemnation. We sought the Lord earnestly with prayer that we might understand his will, and light was given to us by his Spirit, that there must be order and thorough discipline in the church. That organization was essential. System and order are manifest in all the works of God throughout the universe. Order is the law of heaven, and it should be the law among God's people on earth. Elder Tess, there's order and law in heaven. There's order and law in the movement on earth. Ellen White, we had a hard struggle in establishing organization, notwithstanding that the Lord gave testimony after testimony, and Elder Tess says line after line upon this point. The opposition was strong, and it had to be met again and again. But we knew that the Lord God of Israel was leading us and guiding us by his providence. We engaged in the work of organization, and marked prosperity attended this advanced movement. Back to Elder Tess. So read those quotes in your own time. Go through closely what she's saying about that experience and what they were to do. Apply it to our own. This subject of organization in this time period. And then I say refer back to 1730. I think that was up here. Nope. Must be down here. Okay. So she's talking about this. If Christ was genuinely coming back in 1863, so she's referring to this one. In 1863, if they had not failed, would there be any instruction from God to organize in that time period? What would be the point? You're going to have 2 to 3 years of brutal civil war, and that's it. Then go to heaven. There's no need for this movement to organize. There's no need for his, okay, so God, we're going to say God's movement to organize. This subject of organization is for our application, not for an application of Daniel 12:1 to the second advent. It's for our time of trouble. You can see that in the history of the disciples. Both of the dispensations that we apply to our current one from those lines demonstrate to us that there is a work of organization going on in this time. It was necessary for Pentecost. It united the hearts of the disciples. There's going to be no wave of feeling that comes into this movement that prepares us for Pan Am to do our work. The preparation is through proper organization of the movement. So it's not going to be feeling that comes into the movement. It's proper organization. I want to combine these thoughts with a couple of other thoughts on this subject. Every single dispensation, and this was taught in Germany, in the Germany conference of last year, 2019, every single dispensation faces a twofold test. One is the message, and the second is recognizing and accepting leadership. We demonstrated that through our plowing. It's this one. Okay, this board work here, through our plowing, as people had to choose between, so in our plowing, people had to choose between Elder Jeff and the Adventist conference structure. Through the early rain, when they had to identify between Elder Jeff and Path of the Just. In the latter rain, when they had to identify between Elder Primander and Elder Tess and Future for America. The test of organization and leadership occurs in every single dispensation of this movement. Plowing, early rain, latter rain, harvest. It's going to come in our harvest time, and it did, but it's coming much more intensely because it's coming in that exact history where regardless of opposition, we are required to organize. So there's a couple issues. There's the fact that we are to organize based on the lines, so based on these lines here. Based on the chaos and disorder the movement has been in, the lines demonstrate the need to organize. They also demonstrate the opposition that comes from that. This shows, so this boardwork here shows that it's going to be a test. And there are a few other elements, but one specific other element that makes this so hard for us. I'm going to quote from Uriah Smith, June 20, 1865, and the resources URSE ARSH 2011. So I can't remember what ARSH stands for, and I should have figured that out beforehand, but I didn't, sorry. 1865, it's centered around the argument of slavery, which I'm going to remind us is the discussion about equality. So quote from Uriah Smith, quote, "The condition of the Black man at the South is at present in utter uncertainty." So Elder Tess, so it's 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation has gone out, the Civil War has ended, the North has won. And what he's saying is the condition of the Black people in the South, the freed slaves, is utter uncertainty. Uriah Smith, quote, "Can he hold a title to land? Nobody knows. Can he protect his wife? Nobody knows. Can he testify in a court of justice? Nobody knows. None of his rights, natural or civil, are assured to him. The white men of each Southern state claim the right of settling all of those matters. The legislature of Tennessee has just passed a law concerning the freed slaves. Do they enact laws concerning free white people? All that concerns the Black people there is to be regulated by the whites." So back to Elder Tess. So the South has lost the Civil War. There's going to be a new president, Andrew Johnson. He's favorable to slavery. Those Southern states take their rights back because now they get to argue about what they do with the rights of freed slaves. And that's dictated by the South, by the Southern states. Uriah Smith quote, "What will those whites do when their states are reconstructed without slavery? One of them has frankly told us, boasting to a man from the North that the slaveholders would yet have the substantial fruits of victory." So Elder Tess, the South might lose, but he says, we're going to have the fruit of victory. We were defeated in the field, but we're still going to have the rewards of victory. Uriah Smith quote, "They would unite," he said, "with the old Democratic Party." And so in the Democratic Party is switched from back then, right? So the Democratic Party back then would be like the Republican Party now. So they would reunite, and the old Democratic Party would be in the South. They would unite, he said, with the old Democratic Party when the last Congress of Johnson's presidency should come, and then they would show the Union men who had really been whipped in this late hour of the war. The Black race would be kept practically in the condition of serfs, bound to the land. The first admission of a seceded state without Black suffrage would settle the whole question, and then slavery would exist in reality, though not in name. Well, thank you, Luke Advent. So this ARSH stands for Advent Review Sabbath Herald. Thank you. So back to Elder Tess. Similar to the idolatry exists in reality, but not in name. You can't point to a slave in America today, but that mentality has still continued all the way through. The same way you can't point to a golden calf, but that idolatry continued all the way through. Uriah Smith quote, "The North will have been practically conquered. Every drop of blood will have been spilled. and every dollar expanded in vain. Threats have already been made that Reconstruction will be put through next winter on an anti-Black basis, in spite of all opposition. This will be the great question of the next congressional session. This very spring, Mr. Sumner said to Mr. Lincoln, quote from Mr. Sumner, Louisiana must be reconstructed on the basis of the Declaration of Independence, unquote. Lincoln hesitated and did not reply. And Elder Tess adds, he wasn't that good of a man. And Mr. Sumner said, Mr. President, if you reconstruct it on any other basis, count me an opponent. Loud applause. That is the true position for every friend of a permanent union and of a permanent freedom to take and to stand by firmly. Far better that Grant, which is the Northern general, should surrender to Lee, which was the Southern general, then the president should surrender to North Carolina or Louisiana and nullify all the sacrifices, losses, and sufferings of this dreadful struggle. So Elder Tess, what's the point? This is the beginning of Reconstruction. And what can he already in June of 1865 see happening? Who's won the war? It's not so easy to say the North. The South is already bragging, quote, just you wait and see who really won the war. So, and when those Southern states then get to have that return of their states' rights, you can see what they did with this concept of freedom. And that's all history that is easily accessible and has been discussed in the movement. I want us to consider one thing, and we'll try and tie these points together in a moment. What's the issue today? You have the split between globalism and unilateralism. And just remind us that, yes, this was presented about 2 years ago, but this is what is separating the world. There's two sides. It's not just the United States. So you have this split between globalism and unilateralism. And I'll remind us how she had this presented. So this one world government, as the people that watch Fox News, Fox sees this as a threat. They see globalism as a threat. And for these people who see globalism as a threat, their hero is Trump. And this globalism is built on conspiracy theories, and included with that globalism is racism and sexism. And on the other side, CNN sees this as a threat. Right. I don't think I have that right. Yes, so these people see globalism as a threat, right? Okay, and CNN, we see CNN, the left sees unilateralism as a threat, and unilateralism is the one superpower, unilateralism, one superpower. And this group sees Trump as a dictator, and this is built on parable methodology, right? Okay, so I think I got that right. Let me know if I messed that up. So you have the split between globalism and unilateralism. The globalism side are people who are opposed to the UN, where Trump is the hero. And the unilateralism side are opposed to dictatorship. So I want us to describe what that looks like. You have the UN, and then what do you have underneath it? You have all these individual countries. So we're going to go to this board work. Whoops. Going to this board work. I'll give you a peek of it. Looks like that. So you might have Russia, and you might have Japan. You might have Saudi Arabia. You have the United States. So there's two factions in the world today, those who support this order and those who oppose it. So this UN order. And those who are saying that the threat is globalism are opposed to this leadership, because what does it do? What did it threaten to do in 2003? It threatened to violate the American sovereignty because they wanted to invade Iraq. They're controlled by the UN. The nations that participate have a restraint placed upon their behavior by the United Nations. If they go so far that they violate the UN, violate that, then the UN intervenes. They may shut them down. They may invade them. They may no longer work with them. They may place sanctions on them. But every one of those countries that composes the UN does not have its own sovereignty. And yet we did it anyway. And were there any sanctions, or we got away with it? I don't understand how we got away with it. I really don't. This has started to become a problem, particularly from Ronald Reagan through George Bush years and under Donald Trump today. Today being back in August 2020. Because what this union does is it violates American sovereignty. It violates American sovereignty because they're controlled by an organization above themselves. You come down to the League of Nations, what was the issue? It was the same thing. If you're going to have this League of Nations, it would violate unilateralism and American sovereignty. And having this union, you can't have America act unilaterally. Because of that, Protestants were opposed to it, and it caused the split between Protestantism. What I want us to see is that you have the exact same thing in the history of the Civil War. You have the federal government. Elder Parmenter has taught this before, I'm pretty sure, I can't remember exactly where, but Elder Parmenter has taught, I think quite recently, that when you come to this line, refer to this order, when you come to this line, this history of our Alpha, beginning, so the Millerite Alpha, beginning in the modern, the Alpha beginning of modern Israel, this time of trouble, American Civil War, how worldwide was that? The Sunday Law, Millerite 1850, how worldwide was that? It wasn't. This is a fractal of what we see has become global today. So in this history, like a condensed version, it all centers on the United States. There is nowhere in India or Saudi Arabia or Poland that is enacting a Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. It's not global. It's centered in the United States. This Civil War, this time of trouble, is centered in the United States. This isn't a global pandemic. It's an American centralized problem. So everything that we now see as global back in our Alpha history was centralized. And that has implications to what I'm about to say. So if this is centralized, we're going down here. If this is centralized, then what is the argument going to be about? It's going to be about the organization of the United States. Now we have, what now is the United Nations was then the federal government. So back in the 1800s, during the Civil War, it was the federal government. So it was the overarching government that controlled the behavior of the states. And under it, you had states. You had Alabama, you had Arkansas, you had Texas. And what problems do those states have? The federal government controls us. How much freedom do those states have under a, if he was a good president, Lincoln government? Not that much. And they can see it coming. So what do they start to do? They start to fight. What we have in the movement is this exact same structure. We have an overarching leadership, and then we have ministries. So, but what we have is the exact same structure, We have a movement leadership, Elder Perminder and myself, so Elder Tess, so Elder Perminder, Elder Tess, and the continental leaders on this level, so the leadership. And then we have the ministries, so these are the ministries. And what we're facing today is how do these ministries feel about organization? Many of them, no problem, but there are problems in our movement today when you start finding a redefinition, not just of liberalism and conservatism, but the words freedom and religious liberty. Since I presented over 2 years, almost 2 years on the subject of liberal and conservative, those titles, those words have been somewhat redefined. Okay, so she's talking about, so this is back 2 years ago, and she's already been talking about this for 2 years. So this is in 2020. She started talking about this in 2018, right? So now, present time, Vespers, she's been talking about this for 4 years. Since I presented over the last 2 years, almost 2 years, on the subject of liberal and conservative, those titles, those words have been somewhat redefined as it exists in history. In application of that history, we are not speaking about reforms. We are talking about social liberalism and social conservatism, not about makeup or jewelry or any of these other topics. When we come to talking about freedom and religious liberty, the issue is when those become redefined. Because who is arguing on behalf of freedom and religious liberty? Which side most often? It's this conservative side. It's not the true side that's arguing consistently, over and over again, that they must have their freedoms and they must have their religious liberty. It comes to 1850, 1861. So down here. So when it comes to 1850, if you just lay it at 1861, the Civil War, how much freedom was the South supposed to have? They did not have freedom. Did they have religious liberty to practice their religious beliefs in whatever manner they chose? No, they were not given that freedom. So let me, I'm going to come back to this. I just want to show you the board work so you can have that in mind. So she's doing this whole board work right here. So she's got the, she started in 1619. So over the presentations previous, and she's got all these, she's talking about the Protestant split between conservative, the people following Adams, and the liberal people following Jefferson. And then along the way they've been fighting for it. And so right in here, they're fighting for freedom, religious liberty, and states' rights in this area. Okay. So they were not given freedom. Through 1888, they were not given that freedom. Come to 1919, here, all that has happened in the history of world wars. So here is what was condensed in our Alpha history, has been concentrated in America, has blown out and become a worldwide subject. So it's gone from civil war, from a federal government under states, to the League of Nations, a league over state countries, to the United Nations. So which is just another league over independent state countries, which brings us back to the arguments made by the South in those documents when they're fighting for state rights. People contact me today, so Elder Tess saying, people contact me today, it was about 2 years ago. I get these messages, they're kind of sarcastic, and they happen more and more and more frequently. When people message and they say, don't I have the freedom? When they phrase it as, don't I have the freedom? The expectation is, I taught freedom. I taught equality. So I'm in a corner and I have to say, of course you have the freedom. The truth of the matter is you don't. You don't have the freedom. if you've messaged me that question recently, I'm giving you the answer. In this movement, we do not have freedom and religious liberty the way some portray it. We have a couple of issues that we're facing. Okay, so let me show you. We're coming up on this line right here. We have a couple of issues that we're facing. We must organize after. We must organize after the pattern of 1861, 1863. Individuals look at that and believe that that is dictatorship of Babylon to organize and bring in order. Ministers who should be supporting that still stay silent and subtly oppose the work of organization because they're afraid of their reputation. It's necessary to bring us to Pentecost. What will unite us in the upper room is correct organization. So what will unite us in the upper room is correct organization. It is the test of this dispensation in a special way. It is in every dispensation, but never as much as in this dispensation comes the test identifying leadership and enacting correct organization. And then I went to the quotes of 1865 and freedom in the South. Last year, there was a message of equality presented. And in that message, we said, in this movement, there is no submission based on nationalism or based on sexism. There was an emancipation proclamation for the women of this movement. That's all well and good. And that's where many ministers expected it to stay. Just say that they are equal and leave it there. And the problem is that neither Elder Parminder nor myself have done that. We have become personally involved in the way that ministries organize and function. We have required them and send us, we have required them. You send us your preaching rosters. You give us evidence. The reason that we're doing that is this exact same issue. It isn't enough to proclaim equality and freedom. Then were the states to be left to enact that after the dictates of their own state rights? No, they did not have the freedom to do that. They did not have the religious liberty to do that. Not in 1865, shouldn't have in 1919, and shouldn't have had in 2003. This claim about religious liberty and freedom is misused in the movement today. In the exact same fashion, it's being used by the far right, often by those who in chat groups insist that they must have their freedom and religious liberty not violated, that speak on behalf of liberalism. They don't realize as they fight for their version of liberalism, they're doing that with the exact same mindset as the South and the far right. They're making the exact same arguments for unilateralism, for dictatorship, in opposing the leadership of this movement. They think they are arguing for liberty. They are arguing for state rights and dictatorship. As ministries believe that they have the right to organize themselves without oversight, they are fighting on behalf of state rights and dictatorship. The dictatorship does not come from the leaders, head leaders. It does not come from the UN. It does not come from the League of Nations. It was not going to come under Abraham Lincoln. The dictatorship came through the states when they refused to accept oversight. Reconstruction happened because Emancipation Proclamation was made, and then the states were left to enact it themselves. And I went to countries that said, we never believed, we never knew that organization, that equality required us to change our behavior, not in our homes, not in our ministries, not in any fashion. We didn't know that we had to treat our wives as equals. We thought this was some type of theological concept, and left to our own devices, all that we would have had was a return to slavery. But we won't leave them to their own devices. We must have correct organization outside, and including the subject of equality. So the questions are asked today, don't I have the freedom? Don't we have the right? And the answer is no, you don't have the right. You don't have the freedom, not as part of this kingdom. If people want to secede from the union, they can do that. But identify it as the test that it is, and that the arguments made on behalf of so-called freedom are fighting on behalf of states' rights. There is a requirement about how we operate. The South consistently have this chip on their shoulder from the very beginning all the way through, where they constantly see that their freedom is being impinged, that their state rights are not being respected, that their liberties are being violated, that their consistent chip on their shoulder, if you can say that, so to speak, you see that in the movement today, people need to realize the reason we have not gone to the Gentiles is because the disciples in this history, just after the chaos, what are they saying? Restore your kingdom, restore Israel. You rose from the dead, surely you can kill the Romans. Do they get it? No. Why? Because they're nationalistic. The issue of racism is much broader than black and white. The issue of racism has been funneled down through this narrow perspective to just see the issues of black and white and racial equality in the United States today. It's correct to do that. It's correct to see that, but the issues of nationalism are much broader than people realize. This is the country saying, you're from Kenya, you bigot, you can't tell me what to do. You can't tell me how to behave. You can't suggest to me that I'm doing anything wrong. You're from Australia. You're a colonialist. Don't come to my state. Don't come to Uganda or South Sudan or Africa and tell us not to enact dowry payment. We are an independent state. We have the right to enact our own version of slavery. And the government says, no, you don't. You don't have the right as a ministry or as an individual to practice something that goes against the conscience of this movement. As this divide is occurring, because this will cause a shaking, it will because it does in every single dispensation on the testimony of 2 or 3, and we have 3. It will be a shaking in this dispensation. We have to correctly identify when we use the word freedom. Are we arguing for correct freedom, or are we arguing for our personal state rights? People are arguing for freedom, freedom in the context of this message that teaches against racism and sexism, and yet they're still arguing for freedom from a nationalistic perspective, where in their own country, their own nation, whether it's European, American, Australian, wherever it is from, that they have a right to be led by their own. And anyone else impinging on the work in their own field is impinging on their state rights. That's fine, but they need to understand what argument they're using, because it's not this argument for abolition. It's not the argument for globalism. It's this conservative freedom. It's this conservative version of religious liberty. It's this conservative state version of state rights. Regardless of what they think about vows or what they think about reforms or all of those different issues, regardless if they're arguing on forums on subjects that relate to LGBT community, understand that the behavior is nationalistic. And while they're fighting for freedom, they never passed the test of nationalism. The disciples hadn't gotten it yet. Much of this movement has not gotten it yet. We need to expand the definition of racism, sexism. Take racism, identify for what it is. It is not condensed in the United States. It is a worldwide subject of nationalism, where we belong to a kingdom that does not care what country you come from, what culture you come from, and it does not care where your leaders come from. No one cares No one should care where Obama came from. No one should care whether he's Hawaiian or Texan. I know he grew up in Hawaii. For a US president, you don't even identify what state they come from because they don't represent their state. They represent the entire union. We have a crisis in this movement today, not because I'm saying everything is terrible right now. I'm saying that because the lines say so. We are to organize. Many people believe that organization is Babylon. Babylon is a dictatorship. Ellen White says that the chaos and the disorder is Babylon, not the organization. We can see on multiple lines that organization is what is required to bring us into union as believers and fit to do our work at Pentecost. We can see that it is a test of every dispensation, no more so than, I think I have too many then, so no more so than the dispensation that we're currently in as we prepare to do this work. We understand that there are two versions of the movement, just as there are two versions of Protestantism, just as there are two versions in the entire world about what freedom and religious liberty is. Not every use of freedom is correct, and not every call to respect someone's liberty is accepted. Okay, so now she gets directly talking to us. I mean, like she's been talking to us, but now she's getting serious. So statement to the movement. There's a different problem in this movement. It becomes a little harder for this movement, and that is that no one elected me. No one elected the leaders of this movement. So you didn't vote for me. I'd also like to turn that on its head a little. I didn't run for office. I was going to teach in October 2018, come home to my fire and my cooking and my dog. That was the plan. So I didn't run for office. So I'm trapped within what God set up. You're trapped within what God set up. We take our cues from God. I don't have freedom. You don't have freedom. We're all following the lines. So when someone asks me, do I have freedom? I'm not the one restraining your freedom. God is. If people can't see the difference, that it's not me restraining your freedom, it's God restraining your freedom, the resentment will be on me. But understand why I'm saying what I'm saying, why I'm even here. If I had known what the last year would hold, I may have never taught. But we follow the steps God leads us on because God's the one in control. We're not the one in control. God says equality, we implement equality, both as a theological concept and also in how we expect every corner of this ministry to behave and operate, from a church fellowship through the larger ministries, through to continental leaders, right down to how Elder Parmenter and I, Elder Tess, operate ourselves. We are held by the same rules. And what is happening is the people that do not recognize that God is in control, that God has placed those leaders, that God has put those rules and regulations on this movement, they blame us. And when people tell them, actually the leaders say you don't have the freedom, what are they called? Bigots. But remember, they're not fighting against me. They're fighting against a message that I was not in control over. So you can be a slave with me or you can succeed. I'm following those lines. We need to understand in this dispensation more than any other what the tests are. It may be that the message of this dispensation shakes very few people, but enacting organization, that is going to be difficult. It was in the time of the Millerites when many opposed, when leading ministers opposed. That shouldn't stop us. So as people use the words freedom and religious liberty, when they use the term bigotry, when they engage in, as I spoke of last week, not just the arguments they're making, but the FFA behavior they're using to argue for FFA teachings. Recognize what they're doing. You're using FFA methods, FFA methodology, and FFA behavior to argue on behalf of this conservative freedom and religious liberty, not the freedom and religious liberty that this movement teaches. God has led us out so far. I'm subject to whatever he does next. I don't know what he will do next. I'm as much having to follow that as everyone else. God has led us this far for a reason. We need to understand. We need to have faith in the lines. It's the lines that hold us and give us confidence in what God is doing and what he has done. If you go back to those lines, you'll understand why we are in this position. When we understand that organization is on the lines, what organization is meant to look like, how it's meant to be implemented, what it's meant to stand for. That we are not there to defend state rights when they violate correct organizational procedures and equality. When people can see it on the line, they know that this isn't me. It's not me telling you what I think. It's a voice pointing you to the word of God. Okay, so it's already 1:20, and so and this is a long prayer. So I say, so I'm going to read this prayer, and I'm gonna pray because it's a really good prayer, and this is a good prayer. So if you'll kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear God in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Lord, we have to do all of this work in the time of trouble, when people are suffering personal pain, when they are struggling with their own personal attacks of the devil. We have to do this when we are scattered, when there is uncertainty. So many issues come at once to destroy this movement. But we recognize, Lord, that you have been in control. The lines teach us this in a history of success. The lines teach us we will get ready. We will do the work. We will go to the Levites. We will go to the Nethinims. We will have a people prepared for the second advent. Lord, there is no certainty that any one of us will be standing there on that day. But I pray, Lord, that we will prepare ourselves, that we will not let nationalism or sexism or our own version of freedom and states' rights stand in the way. Separate us from members of the movement, or separate us from members of the movement. Lord, where these sins exist, may we see them and root them out. May we learn to behave as we would as disciples of Christ. Jesus said they were to be known, not as sons of thunder, not as disciples of the first angel. They were disciples of the second angel. The disciples of the second angel are recognized by the love that they have for one another. May we put this into place in how we behave on forums, how we speak to each other, the words that we use, and how we approach organization. Thank you for the many people through the movement, Lord, who you have raised up in whatever capacity they are, whether they're teaching children to be prepared for their kingdom, the next generation, which won't become the next generation until heaven, that they're preparing them for that work. For all the board members of the movement, Lord, who are doing their part to teach the congregation to turn around in this slide of nationalism and sexism that the whole world is descending into. As they fight against that current, each board member, Lord, each elder, each continental leader, each member of this movement in their own sphere, Lord, is doing your work to share your message, and you have raised them. I pray, Lord, that we will put our faith in you, put our faith in the lines, put our faith in how you have guided us thus far, that we will not believe that you've led us this far to let us die in the wilderness. We know you're in the wilderness. We're in those 40 days of temptation. But Lord, you did You didn't lead us out to die here as a movement. We have a work to do. Lord, our hearts ache for each member that is sliding away from the lines. We love them. We love the ones that have already left. We love the ones that stand and attack us. But Lord, our love can't just hold them. The lines have to. Help us to represent you correctly to them and not to be a stumbling block to them. We are in solemn times. I pray, Lord, that as we suffer personal attacks, as people suffer and struggle with depression, mental illness, family crisis, all that is coming in this time of trouble, to make it so painful that they will understand your love for them and the true nature of your kingdom. I pray, Lord, that you have mercy on your people. In Jesus' name, amen. That's the longest prayer I've ever heard her say.
Thank you, Christine.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you much.
Thanks, everyone.
We're breaking for the day so that everybody can get to bed early, but those that want to join up again at 2:00 in the morning. And definitely we have left with some things to go look into in our time with the, and if anybody finds the 10 points that were mentioned, put them in the teacher chat if you would in WhatsApp so that we can all grab them, whoever might find that. And I think that was, I don't know, it seems like there was something else I was looking for too. But the freedom, yeah, it's interesting to hear this presentation in light of Vespers and the more and more defined freedom and equality.
I just find it amazing how God wraps things around and the timing of everything. Just amazing. Amazes me.
Yeah.